November 1941. Wright Field, Dayton, Ohio. Lieutenant Colonel Benjamin Kelsey sat alone in his office long after sunset, preparing to make a telephone call that could end his career. The decision he was about to make contradicted direct orders from his superiors. No external fuel tanks for fighter aircraft. The policy was absolute. The bomber advocates who controlled Air Corps doctrine had made that crystal clear. Yet Kelsey reached for his telephone anyway, because he understood something they refused to see. Without drop tanks, American fighters would never escort bombers deep into enemy territory. Without drop tanks, pilots would die. Without drop tanks, America might lose the coming war. He called his contacts at Lockheed Corporation. There were no written orders. There would be no paper trail. Just a handshake agreement between engineers who understood what was coming. 100 P-38 Lightning fighters would be secretly modified with fuel lines, hardpoints, and external tank capabilities. If anyone in the Air Corps hierarchy discovered this unauthorized modification, Kelsey would take full responsibility. If his gamble failed, his military career was finished. But if war came, and every intelligence report suggested it would come soon, those forbidden fuel tanks might mean the difference between victory and catastrophic defeat. Kelsey had no way of knowing that his act of quiet defiance would make possible one of the most audacious missions in military history. 16 months later, on April 18, 1943, 18 P-38, Lightning fighters would lumber down a dirt runway on Guadalcanal, carrying an impossible fuel load. They would fly further than any fighter aircraft had ever flown in combat. They would navigate over 400 miles of open ocean at wave-top height, using only compass, airspeed, and a wristwatch. They would arrive at the interception point within 60 seconds of their predicted time. And they would kill Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor, the strategic genius of the Imperial Japanese Navy, because Kelsey had defied official policy and given them the fuel capacity to reach their target. The story of how forbidden technology killed Japan's greatest admiral begins not with bombs or bullets, but with bureaucratic warfare in the halls of the United States Army Air Corps. It is a story of engineers who saw the future clearly while their superiors clung to obsolete doctrine. It is a story of codebreakers who handed American commanders an opportunity so valuable that some argued it was too dangerous to exploit. And it is ultimately a story of how 18 fighter pilots flew a mission that military planners considered mathematically impossible, succeeding through a combination of innovative technology, brilliant navigation, and courage that bordered on recklessness. The mathematics of aerial warfare in 1941 were brutally simple. Fighter aircraft without external fuel tanks had combat radius measured in hundreds of miles. Heavy bomber formations flying deep into enemy territory operated far beyond that protective umbrella. The solution seemed obvious to fighter pilots and engineers. Attach external fuel tanks to fighters, extend their range, keep bombers protected throughout their mission. Yet the men who controlled American air doctrine rejected this solution with a vehemence that bordered on religious fervor. They called themselves the Bomber Mafia, though that term was coined by their critics. These officers believed with absolute certainty that strategic bombing would win future wars. Heavy bombers flying in tight formations, each bristling with machine guns, would be self-defending. No enemy fighters could penetrate that wall of defensive fire. Long-range fighter escorts would be unnecessary, even wasteful. Resources devoted to fighter development would be better spent building more bombers. The doctrine was elegant, mathematical, and completely wrong. But doctrine becomes policy when believers occupy positions of power. By 1941, the Bomber Mafia controlled the levers of aircraft development in the United States Army Air Corps. Their influence extended to explicit prohibitions. Official policy stated that drop tanks should not be developed or encouraged. Fighter aircraft would not be modified to carry external fuel. Any research in that direction would be stopped. The policy was inflexible, unambiguous, and backed by officers who could destroy the career of anyone who challenged their vision. Benjamin Scoville Kelsey was born on March 9, 1906, in Waterbury, Connecticut. From childhood, he was fascinated by the emerging science of aviation. He attended the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, earning a Bachelor of Science degree in Mechanical Engineering in 1928, followed by a Master of Science degree in Aeronautics in 1932. These were the formative years of aviation engineering, when the discipline itself was barely a generation old. He joined the Army Air Corps on May 2, 1929, becoming both a skilled pilot and a gifted engineer who understood aircraft from propeller blade to tail assembly. By 1934, he was assigned as Fighter Projects Officer at Wright Field, the center of American military aviation development. For the next 11 years, he would occupy a position of extraordinary influence over which fighter aircraft would be developed, tested, and deployed. Kelsey's role placed him directly subordinate to Colonel Oliver Patton Eccles, who served as Air Force Chief Materiel Officer throughout World War II. Eccles was a visionary administrator who understood that the next war would be won or lost based on industrial capacity and technological innovation. He gave Kelsey considerable latitude to pursue fighter development projects that showed promise, even when those projects contradicted prevailing doctrine. The relationship between Eccles and Kelsey would prove crucial. When Kelsey needed protection from the bomber mafia's anger, Eccles provided cover. When regulations needed to be bent or quietly ignored, Eccles looked the other way. Years later, Kelsey would call Eccles the man who won World War II, recognizing that his superior's support had enabled the innovations that proved decisive in aerial combat. The Lockheed P-38 Lightning was Kelsey's signature project, the aircraft that would define his career. Developed in response to a 1937 specification for a high-altitude interceptor, the P-38 incorporated a radical twin-boom design with a central nacelle containing the cockpit and armament. Two Allison V-1710 engines provided power and redundancy. If one engine failed, the pilot could fly home on the other. This reliability would prove invaluable over the vast distances of the Pacific Ocean. The aircraft's armament was concentrated in the nose, one 20mm cannon and four 50-caliber machine guns, all aimed directly forward rather than converging from wing-mounted positions. This configuration gave P-38 pilots exceptional accuracy at long range. The prototype XP-38 first flew on January 27, 1939, with Kelsey himself at the controls, departing from March Field in California. 2 weeks later, on February 11th, Kelsey piloted the aircraft on a transcontinental speed run intended to demonstrate its capabilities to skeptical Army brass. He departed March Air Force Base in California at 10:30 in the morning, climbing to 20,000 feet and pushing the throttles forward. 7 hours and 48 minutes later, he approached Mitchell Field in New York, having set a new coast-to-coast record. But the landing went catastrophically wrong. The carburetors iced up on final approach. The engines quit. Kelsey crash-landed on the Coldstream Golf Course in New York, destroying the only XP-38 in existence. He walked away with minor injuries, but the prototype was a total loss. Despite this inauspicious beginning, Kelsey pushed for continued development. The P-38 had demonstrated speed and range that exceeded anything else in the American inventory. Its twin-engine design provided safety margins that single-engine fighters could never match. Production contracts were signed. By mid-1941, P-38 Lightning fighters were rolling off Lockheed's assembly lines in Burbank, California. They were fast, powerful, and could climb to altitude faster than any fighter then in service. But they lacked one crucial capability: range. The standard P-38 through the P-38H model carried 306 gallons of internal fuel. Later models, the P-38J and P-38L, would increase this to 416 gallons, but those variants did not exist in 1941. At cruise settings, the early models provided approximately 900 miles of total range. Useful for defensive operations, adequate for intercepting bombers approaching American territory, but insufficient for offensive missions deep into enemy airspace. Bomber escort missions over Europe or the vast Pacific would require fighters capable of flying 1,200 miles or more. The solution was obvious to any engineer. Add external fuel tanks that could be dropped when empty or when entering combat. The technology was not complicated. The Japanese had already deployed drop tanks on their Zero fighters in 1940. But American doctrine forbade it. Kelsey understood what was coming. War with Germany seemed increasingly likely. Japan's expansionism in Asia threatened American interests throughout the Pacific. When war came, it would be fought at distances that would stretch American logistics to the breaking point. Fighter escorts would need range that internal fuel alone could never provide. He had to act, and he had to act quietly. In November 1941, 1 month before Pearl Harbor, Kelsey contacted Lockheed. The conversation was brief and carefully worded. Kelsey explained that he wanted drop tank capabilities added to 100 P-38E fighters then under production. The aircraft would be modified with fuel lines running from internal systems to hardpoints under the wings. Attachment mechanisms would be designed to hold external tanks securely during flight, but release them instantly when the pilot pulled a handle in the cockpit. Lockheed engineers understood immediately. They also understood that no written orders would be forthcoming. This modification was unauthorized, borderline insubordinate, and absolutely necessary. They agreed on a handshake. Over the following weeks, Lockheed quietly implemented the modifications. Fuel lines were installed, hardpoints were reinforced, electrical systems were modified so pilots could select whether to draw fuel from internal tanks or external tanks. The changes were incorporated so seamlessly that casual observers would not notice anything unusual. But P-38 pilots would now have the capability to carry external fuel tanks, extending their range by hundreds of miles. All that remained was manufacturing the tanks themselves. External fuel tank design presented engineering challenges more complex than they initially appeared. The tanks had to be aerodynamically shaped to minimize drag. They had to be structurally strong enough to withstand the stresses of flight, but light enough not to overburden the aircraft. They had to seal perfectly, or fuel would leak at altitude where temperatures dropped far below freezing. They had to feed fuel reliably to the engines through transfer pumps and valves. And they had to separate cleanly when jettisoned, falling away without damaging the aircraft's control surfaces or engines. Lockheed engineers designed teardrop-shaped aluminum tanks in 2 sizes. The smaller version held 165 gallons. The larger version held 300 gallons, though some sources note a range of 300 to 330 gallons, depending on specific configuration and fuel density calculations. The tanks were approximately 13 feet long and 3 feet in diameter at the widest point. They attached to hardpoints located between the fuselage and engines, close enough to the aircraft's centerline that even the asymmetric weight of carrying 1 large tank and 1 small tank would not seriously affect handling. The design was elegant, functional, and completely contrary to official Air Corps policy. By early December 1941, the first P-38 fighters equipped with drop tank capability were completing final tests at Lockheed's Burbank facility. Engineers were satisfied that the system worked reliably. Kelsey had successfully defied the bomber Mafia and given American fighter pilots a tool they would desperately need. Then, on December 7, 1941, Japanese carrier aircraft attacked Pearl Harbor. America was at war, and suddenly every assumption about fighter doctrine would be tested in the crucible of combat. The attack on Pearl Harbor killed 2,403 Americans and wounded 1,178 more. 18 ships of the United States Pacific Fleet were destroyed or damaged. 8 battleships were hit, 4 sunk. The Arizona exploded and settled to the harbor bottom, taking 1,177 sailors with her. The Oklahoma capsized, trapping hundreds inside her hull. The Japanese strike force escaped without losing a single capital ship. The attack was a tactical masterpiece, and the man who planned it was Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto. Yamamoto was born April 4, 1884, in Nagaoka, Japan. He was the sixth son of a schoolteacher, and his birth name was Isoroku, meaning 56, his father's age at his birth. He attended the Imperial Japanese Naval Academy, graduating in 1904 just in time to participate in the Russo-Japanese War. At the Battle of Tsushima on May 27, 1905, Yamamoto served aboard the cruiser Nishin when it engaged the Russian fleet. An enemy shell exploded near his battle station. Shrapnel tore through the young officer, severing the index and middle fingers on his left hand and leaving him with permanent scars across his abdomen. He was 21 years old, and he had learned that modern naval warfare was brutal, decisive, and utterly unforgiving. After the war, Yamamoto rose steadily through the naval ranks. He studied at Harvard University from 1919 to 1921, learning English and studying economics and petroleum industry dynamics. He absorbed American culture and travelled extensively across the United States, witnessing firsthand the industrial capacity that would later haunt his strategic planning. He served twice as naval attaché in Washington, observing American naval construction and war planning. By the late 1930s, Yamamoto commanded the Imperial Japanese Navy's First Fleet, and in 1939 he was appointed Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, the most powerful position in the Japanese Navy. Yamamoto opposed war with the United States. He had seen American factories, American resources, American determination. He understood that Japan's initial advantages would be offset by America's overwhelming industrial capacity in any prolonged conflict. When asked about his confidence in defeating America, he reportedly replied that he could run wild for 6 months to a year, but after that, he had no confidence. Japanese leaders ignored his warnings. They believed American democracy was weak, divided, incapable of sustained sacrifice. Yamamoto knew better, but when his country chose war, he planned the attack that would give Japan its best chance of success. The Pearl Harbor strike was designed to cripple American naval power in the Pacific, giving Japan time to seize resource-rich territories throughout Southeast Asia before America could respond. The attack achieved tactical surprise and inflicted devastating damage, but it failed to destroy the Pacific Fleet's aircraft carriers, which were at sea during the attack, and it united American public opinion in ways Japanese planners never anticipated. The sleeping giant Yamamoto feared had been awakened, and it was very angry. 6 months after Pearl Harbor, Yamamoto led the combined fleet to Midway Atoll, seeking to lure the American carriers into decisive battle and destroy them. The operation was ambitious, complex, and based on the assumption that American codebreakers could not read Japanese naval communications. That assumption was catastrophically wrong. American cryptanalysts had broken the Japanese JN-25 naval code. They read Yamamoto's orders, understood his intentions, and positioned 3 American carriers to ambush the Japanese fleet. The Battle of Midway, fought from June 4th through 7th, 1942, destroyed Japanese naval dominance in the Pacific. The main carrier battle occurred on June 4th, with the USS Yorktown sinking on June 7th after sustaining damage. 4 Japanese fleet carriers were sunk. Hundreds of experienced pilots were killed. The carefully trained carrier air groups that had trained together for years were shattered. Japan would never recover from these losses. Yamamoto survived the battle, but his strategic position was destroyed. The 6 months he had promised to run wild were over. Now came the grinding attrition he had always feared. By early 1943, the strategic situation in the Pacific had shifted decisively against Japan. American forces had landed on Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands in August 1942, beginning a brutal campaign that would last until February 1943. The Japanese fought with suicidal determination, but American industrial production was overwhelming. For every aircraft Japan manufactured, America built 5. For every ship Japan launched, America launched 10. The mathematics were inexorable, and Yamamoto knew it. In early April 1943, Yamamoto planned Operation Waigo, a major aerial offensive designed to slow the American advance through the Solomon Islands and New Guinea. Running from April 1st through 16th, the operation gathered 350 Japanese aircraft to strike Allied positions in coordinated attacks. The goal was to halt Allied offensives after Japan's defeat at Guadalcanal and boost Japanese morale through visible action. If successful, the operation might buy Japan a few more months. But Yamamoto knew these were delaying actions, not paths to victory. The war was lost. Only the timing remained uncertain. Following Operation Waigo, Yamamoto decided to inspect Japanese bases in the Upper Solomon Islands to boost morale and assess the results of the offensive. His staff prepared a detailed itinerary. Yamamoto would fly from Rabaul to Balale Airfield near Bougainville Island on the morning of April 18th. The schedule was precise, detailed, and encoded in the Japanese JN-25D naval cipher for transmission to the bases being visited. The message was dated April 13, 1943, designated NTF 131755 in Japanese naval communications. On April 14, 1943, multiple American radio intercept stations picked up the Japanese transmission. The message was forwarded to Fleet Radio Unit Pacific at Pearl Harbor, known as Station Hypo, or more commonly as FRUPAC. Navy cryptanalysts, including traffic analyst John Paul Stevens, who would later serve on the United States Supreme Court from 1975 to 2010, worked on the encoded message. Stevens was not himself a codebreaker, but rather analysed decoded traffic and prepared intelligence summaries. The actual cryptanalysis was performed by specialists including Ham Wright, Tommy Dyer and Alva Laswell. Within hours they had decrypted Yamamoto's complete travel itinerary, arrival time at Balal, departure time, aircraft type, number of escort fighters, every detail an ambush would require. The intelligence was forwarded to Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet. Nimitz immediately recognized the opportunity. Yamamoto was the architect of Pearl Harbor, the strategic genius behind Japan's early victories, the most capable admiral in the Japanese Navy. His death would be a devastating blow to Japanese morale and leadership, but exploiting the intelligence presented risks. If Japan realized their codes were broken, they would change their cipher systems, and America would lose its greatest intelligence advantage in the Pacific. The decision would have to come from the highest levels. Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox presented the intelligence to President Franklin Roosevelt. According to reports that have never been officially confirmed, Roosevelt's response was brief and decisive. Get Yamamoto. Whether Roosevelt actually used those words remains disputed, but the order was clear. Nimitz was authorized to plan and execute a mission to intercept and kill Admiral Yamamoto. The risks to code-breaking security would be managed. The opportunity was too valuable to waste. Nimitz passed the mission to Admiral William Halsey, commander of United States forces in the South Pacific. Halsey, in turn, tasked Rear Admiral Mark Mitcher, commander of air forces in the Solomon Islands, with planning the operation. Mitcher's headquarters was at Henderson Field on Guadalcanal, a captured Japanese airstrip that had been the focal point of months of brutal fighting. From Henderson Field, Mitcher commanded Navy, Marine Corps and Army Air Forces squadrons operating in the Solomons. He studied the intelligence and immediately identified the central problem. Range. The interception point west of Bougainville Island was approximately 435 miles from Henderson Field in straight-line distance. To avoid detection by Japanese coast watchers and radar stations scattered throughout the Solomon Islands, the attacking aircraft would need to fly a circuitous route south and west, adding another 150 miles or more to the outbound leg. Total distance to target would be approximately 600 miles. After the interception, aircraft could fly directly home, making total mission distance roughly 1,000 miles. No fighter aircraft based at Henderson Field had that range. No fighter aircraft anywhere in the Pacific had that range, with one exception: the Lockheed P-38 Lightning. The P-38G model, then operating in the South Pacific, carried 306 gallons of internal fuel. With standard cruise settings, this provided approximately 900 miles of total range. Insufficient for the Yamamoto mission, but Kelsey's unauthorized modifications had given the P-38 one crucial advantage. It could carry external drop tanks. With 165-gallon tanks under each wing, a P-38 could carry an additional 330 gallons of fuel, nearly doubling its range. But even that would barely be sufficient for a 1,000-mile mission that included 10 to 15 minutes of combat at full power. Mitcha's intelligence staff calculated fuel requirements with brutal precision. 600 miles to target at low altitude, flying through humid tropical air that increased fuel consumption. 10 to 15 minutes in the combat zone with engines at full power. 400 miles back to base, climbing to altitude where thinner air improved fuel efficiency. Every gallon would matter. The standard 165-gallon drop tanks would not provide enough fuel. They would need the larger 300-gallon tanks, and therein lay a problem. The 3 P-38 squadrons at Henderson Field had been waiting for drop tanks for weeks. Supply requisitions moved slowly through Army logistics channels, and the Southwest Pacific was low on the priority list. The squadrons had some 165-gallon tanks, but not enough for 18 aircraft. The larger 300-gallon tanks were not available at Guadalcanal at all. If this mission was going to happen, those tanks would need to be found and delivered immediately. Mitcha pulled strings that only an admiral could pull. That night, cargo aircraft departed Port Moresby, New Guinea, carrying a precious cargo. 20 large drop tanks, each holding 300 gallons. The flight crossed hundreds of miles of ocean in darkness, navigating by instruments to reach Henderson Field before sunrise. Ground crews waited on the runway. When the cargo planes landed, crews immediately began installing the large tanks. One 300-gallon tank and one 165-gallon tank on each P-38. The asymmetric configuration placed approximately 1,000 pounds more weight on one side of each aircraft, but the attachment points were close enough to center line that pilots could manage the imbalance. By dawn, 18 P-38 Lightnings were configured for the longest fighter mission yet attempted in the Pacific War. Major John Mitchell, commander of the 339th Fighter Squadron, was selected to lead the mission. Mitchell was 32 years old, from Enid, Mississippi, and already an ace with 5 confirmed kills. He was known for exceptional navigation skills and unflappable calm under pressure. For this mission, he would need both qualities in abundance. Mitcha's briefing was blunt. Mitchell would lead 18 P-38s on a 600-mile over-water flight, navigating by dead reckoning. There would be no radio communication after takeoff. Radio silence was essential to avoid alerting Japanese radar operators. Mitchell would navigate using compass headings, airspeed calculations, and time intervals. After 2 hours of flight at wave-top altitude, he would arrive at the interception point precisely 10 minutes before Yamamoto's scheduled arrival at Balale. Margin of error was measured in seconds. If they arrived early, Japanese radar might detect them. If they arrived late, Yamamoto would be on the ground surrounded by hundreds of Japanese soldiers and 75 Zero fighters based at Kahili Airfield on Bougainville. Mitchell requested one modification to his aircraft: a Navy compass. The standard Army compasses installed in P-38s were adequate for normal navigation, but this mission demanded perfection. Marine Corps Lieutenant Colonel Luther Moore provided a Navy compass that had better precision and stability. Ground crews installed it in Mitchell's aircraft the night before the mission. Every tiny advantage mattered. The mission plan divided the 18 P-38s into 2 groups. 4 aircraft would be the killer flight, responsible for attacking Yamamoto's bombers. Mitchell would lead the remaining 14 aircraft as top cover, providing protection against Japanese Zero escorts and maintaining altitude advantage in case more Zeros scrambled from Kahili. The killer flight would be led by Captain Thomas Lanphier Jr., a 24-year-old from Detroit who had already scored several victories. His wingman would be First Lieutenant Rex Barber. The other two pilots in the killer flight were First Lieutenant Besby Holmes and First Lieutenant Raymond Hine. Intelligence indicated Yamamoto would be flying in a Mitsubishi G-4M bomber, nicknamed Betty by American forces. The Betty was a twin-engine medium bomber adapted for transport duty. It had good range and speed, but it was notoriously vulnerable to gunfire. The Japanese had sacrificed armor protection and self-sealing fuel tanks to save weight and extend range. American pilots called it the Flying Zippo because it ignited so easily when hit. The Betty's vulnerability would prove decisive. 6 Mitsubishi A6M0 fighters from the 204th Kokutai would escort Yamamoto. The Zero was fast, maneuverable, and deadly in dogfights at low altitude. But Japanese Zeros operating from Bougainville typically did not carry radios to save weight. Coordinated defense would be difficult. On the evening of April 17th, Mitchell gathered the 18 pilots selected for the mission. He spread maps across a table in the operations dugout. The room was cramped, hot, and smoky. Admiral Mitchell attended, along with numerous Marine and Navy officers whose normal domain was the Solomons airspace. Mitchell traced the route with his finger. 5 legs, each precisely calculated. They would fly southwest away from Guadalcanal for 85 miles, then turn northwest for 160 miles, then west for 135 miles, then north-northeast for 75 miles, then northwest again directly to the interception point. Total outbound distance, approximately 600 miles. They would fly at 50 feet above the ocean waves to avoid radar detection. Navigation checkpoints would be limited to occasional islands glimpsed in the distance. Everything depended on Mitchell's ability to maintain precise headings and calculate drift caused by winds at wave-top altitude. One pilot asked about the fuel margin. Mitchell was honest. With full internal tanks and the drop tanks, they would have approximately 10 minutes in the combat zone at full power. Enough time to intercept, attack, and escape. If they encountered stronger headwinds than expected, they might not have enough fuel to return home. If combat lasted longer than 10 minutes, some aircraft might run dry before reaching Guadalcanal. If anyone's drop tanks malfunctioned and failed to feed fuel properly, that pilot would have to turn back immediately or risk running out of fuel over enemy territory. The mission was balanced on a razor's edge. Success required perfect execution and considerable luck. Another pilot asked what would happen if they failed to intercept Yamamoto. Mitchell's answer was characteristically blunt. They would have wasted fuel, risked 18 aircraft and pilots, and Yamamoto would remain alive to continue directing Japanese naval operations. Failure was not acceptable. Then someone asked the obvious question. What were their odds of actually finding Yamamoto's Betty bomber in the sky over Bougainville, arriving at exactly the right place and time after 600 miles of dead reckoning navigation? Mitchell thought for a moment. He estimated their chances at approximately 1,000 to 1. The room fell silent. But they were going anyway. Orders from Admiral Nimitz. Orders ultimately from President Roosevelt himself. Yamamoto had planned Pearl Harbor, and now America had a chance for revenge. Mitchell dismissed the pilots to get what rest they could. Takeoff would be 7:25 the following morning, April 18th, 1943. Exactly 1 year after the Doolittle raid on Tokyo. Some operations acquire symbolic timing by accident. Operation Vengeance was timed deliberately. That night, ground crews performed final inspections on all 18 P-38s. Engines were tested, fuel systems were checked. The drop tanks were topped off and inspected for leaks. Ammunition belts were loaded into the 450 caliber machine guns and single 20mm cannon that each P-38 carried in its nose. Some pilots carved messages onto bombs or ammunition cans. Others wrote letters home, though they could not explain where they were going or what they would attempt. Most tried to sleep and failed. At Rabaul, 400 miles to the northwest, Admiral Yamamoto prepared for his inspection tour. His staff urged him to cancel. American air activity had increased recently. Long-range P-38 fighters had been spotted operating further from Guadalcanal than previous intelligence suggested. Flying a predictable route on a precise schedule was dangerous, but Yamamoto refused to alter his plans. Japanese morale in the Solomon Islands was fragile after months of defeats. Troops needed to see their commander, needed to believe that leadership cared about their sacrifices. Cancelling would send the wrong message. The inspection would proceed as scheduled. Yamamoto dressed in the khaki uniform of a Japanese army officer rather than his usual naval whites. The decision was unusual but practical. The bases he would visit were primarily army installations. Wearing army uniform would put the soldiers at ease. He gathered his papers, said goodbye to his staff officers who would remain at Rabaul, and walked to the airfield. 2 G-4M Betty bombers waited, engines warming. Yamamoto would fly in the lead aircraft along with his personal aide and the fleet medical officer. Vice Admiral Matome Ugaki, Yamamoto's chief of staff, would fly in the second Betty with other staff officers. The two admirals had always flown together on previous trips, but at the last minute Yamamoto ordered Ugaki to take the second aircraft. The decision probably saved Ugaki's life, though he would not appreciate that fact for several more hours. At approximately 0600 Tokyo time, which corresponded to roughly 0800 local time at Rabaul, both Betty bombers lifted off from Rabaul's runway. 6 Zero fighters from the 204th Air Group provided escort, splitting into 2 V formations of 3 aircraft each. They climbed to 6,500 feet, a comfortable altitude that provided good visibility and fuel efficiency. The formation turned southeast toward Bougainville, maintaining a steady 180 miles per hour. The flight would take approximately 1 hour. Yamamoto settled into his seat, reviewing papers for his meetings at Balale and Buin. He had no reason to suspect anything was wrong. The route had been transmitted using naval cipher that Japanese cryptographers assured him was unbreakable. The Americans could not possibly know where he would be. At Henderson Field on Guadalcanal, pilots gulped down breakfast, though few had appetite. At 7:10, they walked to the flight line. The 18 P-38 Lightnings sat in a row, each loaded with 3,000 pounds of fuel in internal tanks and drop tanks. The weight would make takeoff challenging. Henderson's runway was dirt, roughly 2,000 feet long, adequate for normal operations, but marginal for overloaded fighters. Admiral Mitchell stood at the end of the runway, personally seeing off each aircraft. He understood the importance of this mission and the risks involved. At 7:25 on the morning of April 18, 1943, Mitchell advanced his throttles and released brakes. His P-38 accelerated slowly, wallowing under the weight of extra fuel. The runway blurred beneath him. He lifted off with barely 50 feet of runway remaining, climbing away in a shallow angle. Behind him, 17 more fighters followed at 30-second intervals. The formation assembled over the water east of Guadalcanal, aircraft joining up into loose combat spread. Then one aircraft reported trouble. First Lieutenant Joseph Moore's drop tanks would not feed fuel to his engines. The selector valves were malfunctioning. He had no choice but to abort. Moore turned back to Henderson Field, his war over before it started. Another aircraft suffered a catastrophic malfunction on takeoff. First Lieutenant James McClanahan felt his right tyre blow out as he accelerated down the runway. Rubber shredded from the wheel. McClanahan managed to keep his aircraft straight and get airborne, but landing at Henderson with a blown tyre was too risky. He followed Moore back to base, 2 aircraft down, both from the killer flight. Mitchell reassigned 2 pilots from the top cover group to join Lanphier and Barber in the killer flight. Holmes and Hine would now attack Yamamoto's bombers, while Mitchell led the remaining aircraft as protection against Zeros. 16 P-38 Lightnings formed up and headed south, dropping to 50 feet above the ocean waves. Radio silence was absolute. Pilots could see each other's aircraft, see Mitchell in the lead position, but could not communicate except by hand signals. They flew so low that spray occasionally misted cockpit canopies. Some pilots later reported seeing sharks in the crystal-clear tropical water. Others reported counting pieces of driftwood floating past. One pilot claimed he dozed briefly, trusting Mitchell to handle navigation. The flight was monotonous, tense, and exhausting. Cockpits grew swelteringly hot in the tropical sun. Pilots sat on parachutes, inflatable rafts, and survival gear, which made for uncomfortable seating during 2 hours of flight. Mitchell navigated by reference to his compass, airspeed indicator, and watch. He calculated wind drift by observing wave patterns on the ocean surface. When he detected wind pushing from one side, he adjusted his heading slightly to compensate. His navigation had to be perfect. Even a 1-degree error maintained over 2 hours would place them miles away from the interception point. There were no second chances. If they missed Yamamoto, they would not have fuel to search. They would have to turn for home and accept failure. The 5-leg route took them on a wide arc, first southwest from Guadalcanal, then gradually curving northwest and finally north toward the interception point. The indirect path added distance but kept them away from Japanese-held islands where coast watchers might spot them and radio warnings. The P-38s droned on, minute after minute, the ocean stretching endlessly in all directions. Fuel gauges slowly dropped as the Allison engines consumed the precious gasoline that Kelsey's forbidden drop tanks provided. At 9:33 in the morning, after 2 hours and 3 minutes of flight, Mitchell spotted the coast of Bougainville Island ahead. He checked his watch. They were exactly on schedule, arriving at the predetermined point at the planned time. The navigation had been flawless. Mitchell keyed his radio for the first time since takeoff, breaking radio silence to alert the other pilots. The call was brief. Bogies, enemy aircraft. Everyone looked up. At 6,500 feet, precisely where intelligence had predicted, 2 Betty bombers flew in loose formation, 6 Zero fighters escorting. The formation was descending toward Balale, 15 minutes from landing. Yamamoto was exactly on time, exactly where the decrypted message said he would be. The 1,000-to-1 odds had just paid off. The time was 9:34 in the morning, 1 minute earlier than Mitchell's calculated interception time of 9:35. His navigation had been accurate to within 60 seconds over a 600-mile flight. Mitchell's P-38s released their drop tanks. 3,000 pounds of weight fell away from each fighter. Aluminum tanks tumbled toward the ocean, splashing down in trails of white spray. Pilots pushed throttles forward. The Allison engines roared to full power. Turbochargers spooled up. The P-38s accelerated and climbed, clawing for altitude and speed advantage. The 4-aircraft killer flight led by Lanphier and Barber separated from the formation, diving toward the Betty bombers. Mitchell led the remaining aircraft to 18,000 feet, positioning to intercept any Zeros that scrambled from Kahili Airfield. In the lead, Betty, someone spotted the P-38s climbing from sea level. The distinctive twin-boom design was unmistakable. American fighters, where no American fighters should be. The Betty pilot threw his aircraft into a hard diving turn toward the jungle canopy, attempting to reach the protection of trees where fighters could not follow. The second Betty followed, both bombers now diving at full power toward the green hell below. The 6 Zero escorts rolled into steep dives, accelerating to intercept the climbing P-38s. Lanphier saw the Zeros diving toward him. He made an instant decision. Rather than continue toward the bombers, he pulled into a steep climbing turn, meeting the Zeros head-on. His guns erupted, tracers slashing through the formation. The Zeros scattered, their coordinated attack disrupted. Lanphier had sacrificed his chance to attack the bombers to protect his flight. Now only Barber remained in position to intercept the fleeing Betty carrying Yamamoto. Barber pressed his attack. He was behind and below the lead Betty, which was now barely 50 feet above the jungle, engines screaming at full power. Barber closed the distance. The range decreased to 200 yards, then 100. He was flying borrowed P-38 Miss Virginia from Lieutenant Robert Petit. He thumbed the firing button. 4 50 caliber machine guns and 1 20mm cannon fired simultaneously. Tracers converged on the Betty's right engine. Metal fragments tore away from the cowling. The engine erupted in flames, streaming black smoke. Barber walked his fire across the fuselage toward the left engine. More hits. The left engine began trailing white smoke, coolant or fuel vaporizing from ruptured lines. The Betty rolled violently left. Barber nearly collided with the stricken bomber, pulling up hard to avoid impact. He looked back. The Betty was going down, trailing smoke from both engines, nose dropping. It hit the jungle canopy and disappeared in an explosion of torn vegetation and flame. Barber had no time to celebrate. Zeros were everywhere. He turned hard, defensive, trying to shake 2 fighters on his tail. His P-38 shuddered as bullets struck home. Metal debris tore away from his wings and fuselage. Warning lights flashed in the cockpit. Barber fought his crippled aircraft away from the combat zone, heading south toward Guadalcanal, wondering if his damaged P-38 would make the 400-mile flight home. Behind him, Holmes and Hine had finally released their stuck drop tanks. They spotted the second Betty, carrying Admiral Ugaki, attempting to escape at wave-top altitude off the coast. Holmes attacked first, firing into the Betty's right engine. The engine began smoking, but Holmes's closure speed carried him past the bomber before he could deliver a killing blow. Hine followed, firing a long burst. Then Barber, despite his damaged aircraft, circled back for one more attack. More hits. The Betty's pilot lost control. The aircraft struck the water at full speed near Moyler Point, disintegrating in a massive splash of white foam and debris. Ugaki, strapped in his seat, felt water rushing into the fuselage. Everything went black. When he regained consciousness, he was floating in the ocean, held up by his life vest, one of only 3 survivors from the second Betty. Everyone on Yamamoto's Betty was dead. Above the engagement, Mitchell's top cover fought a swirling dogfight with 0 fighters scrambling from Kahili. No American P-38s were shot down in this phase of the fight, though several suffered damage. Mitchell saw a column of black smoke rising from the jungle west of Bougainville. That would be the lead Betty, the one carrying Yamamoto. Mission accomplished. Mitchell ordered his formation to disengage and head home. Fuel was already critical. They had been in the combat zone for 11 minutes, 1 minute longer than planned. Every additional second burned fuel they might need to reach Henderson Field. The P-38s turned south, climbing to altitude where thinner air improved fuel efficiency. Several pilots reported fuel gauges showing levels far lower than comfortable. Barber's damaged aircraft was leaking fuel from ruptured tanks, leaving a thin vapour trail across the sky. He calculated whether he had enough fuel to reach home. The math was not encouraging, but turning back meant capture or death. He kept flying south, nursing his damaged engines, watching the fuel gauges drop toward empty. 1 P-38 never made it home. First Lieutenant Raymond Hine disappeared during the engagement, though nobody saw him go down. Japanese records show no 0 losses that day, so Hine was probably not shot down in aerial combat. More likely his aircraft was damaged, perhaps by debris from the Betty he attacked or by ground fire, and he ditched in the ocean or crashed in the jungle. Searches continued until May 28, 1943, but his body was never recovered. He was declared dead on April 19, 1944, exactly 1 year and 1 day after the mission. His remains were eventually declared unrecoverable. The remaining 15 P-38s struggled south across open ocean. Pilots watched fuel gauges with growing anxiety. One by one, drop tanks ran dry and were jettisoned. Then internal tanks began running low. Several pilots calculated they would run out of fuel before reaching Guadalcanal. They tightened their formation, reasoning that if they had to ditch in the ocean, they would do so together where they could assist each other's survival. Search aircraft would have a better chance of finding a group of pilots than individuals scattered across hundreds of square miles. But they made it. One by one, P-38s landed at Henderson Field with fuel tanks nearly dry. Barber's aircraft was so heavily damaged that mechanics counted exactly 104 bullet holes in the fuselage and wings. The aircraft also had a prominent dent in the underside from debris and a damaged intercooler. It was a miracle he had flown 400 miles in that condition. Ground crews and intelligence officers immediately debriefed the pilots. Mitchell reported seeing the column of smoke from the jungle west of Bougainville. Barber reported shooting down a Betty in that location. Lanphier reported engaging Zeros and possibly hitting one Betty, though he was not certain. The confusion of combat made precise accounting difficult, but everyone agreed that at least one Betty had been destroyed, probably both. The question everyone wanted answered was simple. Was Yamamoto on one of those aircraft? They would not know for certain until Japanese recovery teams reached the crash sites. That would take time. The crash sites were in rugged jungle accessible only by foot. Meanwhile, Mitchell's mission had to remain secret. If the Japanese suspected their codes were broken, they would change their cipher systems, and America would lose its intelligence advantage. Halsey and Mitchell immediately began planning additional long-range P-38 missions to other targets in the Solomon Islands. These missions would create the impression that American fighters now routinely flew deep into Japanese-held territory. The Yamamoto kill would appear to be one lucky strike among many routine operations, rather than a carefully planned assassination enabled by broken codes. Japanese recovery teams reached Yamamoto's crash site on April 19th, the day after the shoot-down. They found the Betty's wreckage scattered across a hillside in dense jungle. Yamamoto's body was discovered still strapped in his seat, which had been thrown clear of the aircraft during impact. His white-gloved hand still gripped his katana sword. 2 bullet wounds had killed him instantly. 1 round had entered his left jaw and exited through his right eye. Another had struck his left shoulder. The wounds were consistent with being attacked from behind and below, exactly what Barber had described. The forensic evidence supported Barber's claim that he had shot down the Betty carrying Yamamoto. The autopsy performed by Japanese medical officers confirmed that both wounds were from .50 caliber bullets, matching the armament of the P-38 Lightning. The head wound had killed Yamamoto before the aircraft crashed. He had died in his seat at the moment of the attack, never knowing what hit him. His body showed no other injuries from the crash itself, indicating he was already dead when the Betty slammed into the jungle. Japan initially kept Yamamoto's death secret. The official announcement was delayed until May 21, 1943, more than a month after the shoot-down. When the news was finally released, the Japanese public was devastated. Yamamoto was a national hero, the architect of early victories, the naval genius who had humiliated the Americans at Pearl Harbor. His death was announced as having occurred during combat operations, with no mention of the circumstances. The truth that he had been ambushed because of broken codes remained hidden. Japanese military leaders suspected something was wrong with their communications security, but they never definitively determined that the JN-25 code had been compromised. In America, the military kept Operation Vengeance highly classified. The pilots who flew the mission were ordered not to discuss it publicly, but secrecy proved impossible to maintain. In late May 1943, Time magazine published a brief article that hinted at the mission, though without full details. Then, in October 1943, Time published a detailed article about the mission, including specifics about the interception and naming Captain Thomas Lanphier as the pilot who shot down Yamamoto. The leak infuriated Navy intelligence officers who understood how much damage had been done to code-breaking security. An investigation was launched to determine who had leaked classified information to the press. The source was never definitively identified, though Lanfear himself was suspected of talking to reporters. The publicity had consequences. Major John Mitchell had been nominated for the Medal of Honor for his brilliant navigation and leadership during the mission. After the Time magazine article compromised operational security, Mitchell's nomination was downgraded to the Navy Cross, still an exceptional honor but not the nation's highest award. All the pilots who flew the mission eventually received Navy Crosses, recognizing their courage and achievement. But Mitchell's navigation, which made the entire operation possible, should have earned the Medal of Honor. The leak cost him that recognition. The controversy over who actually shot down Yamamoto persisted for decades. Lanfear claimed credit, describing how he had climbed into the Zeros, then dove down to attack Yamamoto's Betty from above. His account made for dramatic storytelling. He pursued a political career after the war and frequently recounted his version of events in speeches and interviews. Barber maintained that Lanfear had never been in position to attack Yamamoto's Betty, that Barber alone had pursued the lead Betty into the jungle and destroyed it. Other pilots who witnessed the engagement supported Barber's account. The confusion arose partly because two Bettys were shot down, and the Americans initially did not know which one carried Yamamoto. In later years, Japanese survivors provided testimony that resolved the controversy. The wreckage evidence, the autopsy report on Yamamoto, and the accounts of Zero pilots who witnessed the attack all supported Barber's claim. He had attacked from behind and below, exactly as the forensic evidence indicated. The bullets had entered from the rear and travelled forward through Yamamoto's body. This trajectory was consistent with a stern attack from a pursuing aircraft, which matched Barber's description of the engagement. Lanfear had engaged the Zeros, sacrificing his chance to attack the bombers to protect his flight. Both pilots had performed their duties courageously. But historical evidence now conclusively shows that Rex Barber fired the rounds that killed Admiral Yamamoto. In 1991, an official Air Force review attempted to resolve the controversy by crediting both Lanfear and Barber with half a kill each. This bureaucratic compromise satisfied neither man and ignored the clear evidence supporting Barber's account. Recognition of the full truth came too late for Barber, who died in 2003 still fighting for proper credit. Lanfear had died in 1987, maintaining his claim to the end. Yamamoto's death profoundly affected Japanese naval operations for the remainder of the war. He was replaced as Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet by Admiral Minichi Koga, a competent but uninspired officer who lacked Yamamoto's strategic vision and aggressive instincts. Japanese naval operations after April 1943 became increasingly defensive and reactive. The initiative in the Pacific War had passed permanently to the United States. Japan would win no more major battles. The long retreat toward the home islands had begun. The larger strategic impact of Operation Vengeance extended beyond Yamamoto's death. American codebreakers had demonstrated that Japanese naval communications were compromised, though Japan never fully acknowledged this reality. Japanese reluctance to completely overhaul their cipher systems gave American intelligence continued access to operational planning throughout the war. The ability to read Japanese naval messages provided American commanders with advantages that shortened the war and saved American lives. Yamamoto's death was important, but the preservation of America's code-breaking capabilities was arguably more valuable. Japan held a state funeral for Yamamoto on June 5, 1943. The date was chosen as the 9th anniversary of Admiral Togo's burial, linking Yamamoto to Japan's greatest naval hero. He was posthumously promoted to Marshal Admiral, the highest rank in the Imperial Japanese Navy, and awarded the Order of the Chrysanthemum. Nazi Germany awarded him the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross with oak leaves and swords, one of Germany's highest military decorations. His ashes were divided, with some buried in Tokyo's Tama Cemetery beside Admiral Togo, and the remainder interred at his family's burial grounds at Chuko Temple in Nagaoka City. The technological factor that made Operation Vengeance possible deserves recognition alongside the codebreaking and tactical execution. Without drop tanks, the mission would have been impossible. Kelsey's defiance of the bomber Mafia in November 1941 created the capability that proved decisive. The chain was clear. Kelsey authorized the modifications. Lockheed implemented them. The P-38s at Henderson Field had the hardpoints and fuel systems required. When Mitchell needed fighters that could fly 1,000 miles, the P-38s could be configured for that mission. Without Kelsey's foresight, Yamamoto would have completed his inspection tour. The drop tank story did not end with Operation Vengeance. Throughout 1943 and 1944, American fighters equipped with external fuel tanks extended their range across both theatres. P-38S with drop tanks escorted bombers deep into Germany, protecting them from Luftwaffe fighters and dramatically reducing bomber losses. In the Pacific, P-38s with drop tanks flew missions exceeding 1,000 miles, striking Japanese bases far beyond previous reach. The P-51 Mustang, when equipped with drop tanks, could escort bombers from England to Berlin and back. The P-47 Thunderbolt with drop tanks became a devastating long-range fighter bomber. By 1944, even the most dogmatic bomber advocates had to acknowledge reality. Drop tanks were essential tools that multiplied the effectiveness of both fighters and bombers. The official policy that had forbidden drop tank development was quietly abandoned. Nobody apologized for the earlier prohibition. Nobody acknowledged that Kelsey had been right and the bomber Mafia had been wrong. But the policy changed, and American fighters continued extending their range as drop tank technology improved. The statistical impact tells the story. Before long-range fighter escorts became routine in Europe, bomber crews faced approximately 25 to 30 missions before they would statistically be shot down, killed, or captured. After continuous fighter escort using drop tank-equipped fighters, bomber crews' survival odds improved dramatically. A bomber crew completing a full tour of 25 missions became probable rather than miraculous. The difference measured in thousands of lives saved. Charles Lindbergh's contributions to P-38 range extension came in mid-1944, over a year after Operation Vengeance. Lindbergh, who had been denied military service because of his pre-war opposition to American involvement in the war, worked as a civilian technical consultant for United Aircraft. He departed for the Pacific on April 24, 1944, and flew his first combat mission on May 21st through 22nd. Between May and September 1944, he flew approximately 50 missions and demonstrated fuel conservation techniques that further extended the Lightning's range. He taught pilots to reduce engine RPM to 1600, set carburetors to auto-lean, and fly at reduced airspeeds. These techniques reduced fuel consumption from 90 gallons per hour to 70 gallons per hour, increasing range by hundreds of miles, sometimes as much as 400 miles. P-38 pilots who had considered 6 to 8 hour missions the maximum discovered they could fly for 10 hours using Lindbergh's methods. But Lindbergh's techniques came too late to affect Operation Vengeance. The mission succeeded using standard fuel management procedures, relying entirely on the extra capacity provided by drop tanks. Kelsey's modifications made the mission possible. Mitchell's brilliant navigation brought the fighters to the interception point at exactly the right time. Barber's accurate gunnery destroyed Yamamoto's Betty, and the P-38 Lightning, equipped with technology that violated official doctrine, proved itself as the only American fighter capable of flying the mission. The P-38 Lightning became one of the most successful American fighters in the Pacific theater. During the war, more than 1,800 Japanese aircraft were destroyed by P-38s. Over 100 P-38 pilots became aces, achieving 5 or more confirmed kills. The two highest-scoring American aces of World War II, Major Richard Bong with 40 victories and Major Thomas Maguire with 38 victories, both flew P-38s in the Pacific. The Lightning's long range, reliability, and heavy firepower made it ideally suited for the vast distances and harsh conditions of the Pacific campaign. Total P-38 production during the war reached 10,037 to 10,038 aircraft, depending on how prototype and test aircraft are counted. The P-38 served in every theatre of World War II, though it achieved its greatest success in the Pacific and Mediterranean. In the European theatre, it was gradually replaced by the P-51 Mustang, which had superior high-altitude performance. But in the Pacific, where long range over water and twin-engine reliability mattered most, the P-38 remained a frontline fighter until the war's end. But the P-38's role in Operation Vengeance remained its most famous mission. The shoot-down of Yamamoto demonstrated that even the most careful operational security could be compromised by superior intelligence. It showed that long-range fighters could execute precision missions beyond what military planners considered possible. And it proved that technological innovation, even when it violated official policy, could have strategic consequences that changed the course of wars. The men who made Operation Vengeance possible came from diverse backgrounds. Benjamin Kelsey was an engineer and test pilot who understood that regulations sometimes needed to be ignored for the greater good. John Mitchell was a fighter pilot from Mississippi who could navigate 600 miles across open ocean using nothing but compass and watch. Rex Barber was a young lieutenant who maintained his composure in the chaos of aerial combat and delivered accurate fire under extreme pressure. Admiral Mitchell was a staff officer who recognized an intelligence opportunity and acted decisively to exploit it. Chester Nimitz was a fleet commander who understood that killing Yamamoto was worth risking America's greatest intelligence advantage. And the Navy cryptanalysts, including Ham Wright, Tommy Dyer, Alva Laswell, and traffic analyst John Paul Stevens, provided the intelligence that made the mission possible. None of these men could have succeeded without the others. Cryptanalysts provided the intelligence, but without fighters that could reach Bougainville, the intelligence was useless. Mitchell's navigation brought the fighters to the right place, but without drop tanks they could never have attempted the flight. Barber's gunnery killed Yamamoto, but without decoded messages revealing his schedule, Yamamoto would never have been in the wrong place at the wrong time. The operation succeeded because of a chain of capabilities, each link essential. The Americans who planned and executed Operation Vengeance went their separate ways after the war. Most returned to civilian life, carrying memories they could not discuss because the mission remained classified for many years. John Mitchell retired from the Air Force as a colonel and lived until 1995. Rex Barber became a civil engineer and spent decades fighting for recognition that he had shot down Yamamoto's Betty. He died in 2003. Thomas Lanphier pursued a political career and continued claiming credit for killing Yamamoto until his death in 1987. Admiral Mark Mitchell continued commanding carrier forces throughout the Pacific War, earning a reputation as one of the Navy's most aggressive and effective admirals. He died in 1947, his health broken by years of combat operations. Admiral William Halsey became one of America's most famous naval officers. He died in 1959. Chester Nimitz retired as Fleet Admiral and lived until 1966, witnessing the post-war evolution of naval power, including nuclear-powered submarines and aircraft carriers. Admiral Matome Ugaki, who survived the crash of the second Betty bomber, continued serving in the Japanese Navy. On August 15, 1945, hours after Japan announced its surrender, Ugaki led a final kamikaze mission against Allied ships near Okinawa. His aircraft was shot down and he was killed. He chose death over the dishonor of surrender, following the samurai code that had defined his life. Benjamin Kelsey received relatively little public recognition during his lifetime. His role in developing drop tanks for the P-38 remained classified for decades after the war. He was promoted to Brigadier General on September 5, 1952, and retired on December 31, 1955. He worked in the aerospace industry and consulted on fighter development programs. He never sought public recognition for his role in enabling Operation Vengeance. Kelsey died on March 3, 1981, at age 74, having lived long enough to see American fighters evolve from the piston-engine P-38s he helped develop to supersonic jets like the F-15 Eagle. He never flew in combat, despite his extensive test pilot experience, because his engineering expertise was considered too valuable to risk in combat zones. But his contributions to American air power extended far beyond Operation Vengeance. He was instrumental in developing the P-51 Mustang, arguably the best fighter aircraft of World War II. He pushed for development of the P-80 Shooting Star, America's first operational jet fighter. The lesson of Operation Vengeance extends beyond the specific circumstances of killing Admiral Yamamoto. Military organizations must balance the need for standardized doctrine against the reality that doctrine becomes obsolete as technology evolves. Regulations serve important purposes, providing structure, consistency, and predictability. But regulations that prevent innovation can be as dangerous as no regulations at all. Kelsey understood that challenge. He knew the bomber mafia's prohibition on drop tanks was wrong. He knew that fighters would need long range in the coming war. He could have followed orders and avoided risk to his career. Instead, he authorized modifications without written orders and accepted personal responsibility if his gamble failed. That decision created the capability that killed Yamamoto and saved thousands of lives over the following years. The ironies are numerous. Yamamoto opposed war with America because he understood American industrial capacity would overwhelm Japan in any prolonged conflict. He was killed by American technology that demonstrated exactly the kind of innovation he feared. He died because Japanese cipher systems were not as secure as Japanese cryptographers believed, and he died precisely on schedule because his own punctuality made him vulnerable to ambush. The Americans who planned and executed Operation Vengeance risked their code-breaking capabilities, their most valuable intelligence asset, for the chance to kill one man. That gamble could have backfired catastrophically if Japan had recognized their codes were compromised. The Japanese never made that connection, but the risk was real. Whether the gamble was worth it remains debatable. Yamamoto's replacement was less capable, but Japan's strategic situation in April 1943 was already desperate. Perhaps the greatest irony is that Yamamoto's death had more symbolic than strategic impact. Japanese morale suffered when their greatest naval hero was killed. American morale received a boost from revenge for Pearl Harbor. But the Pacific War's outcome was determined by industrial production, not individual leaders. America was building aircraft carriers faster than Japan could sink them. American factories were producing aircraft at rates Japan could never match. The numbers were inexorable. Yamamoto understood this reality better than most Japanese leaders. His death removed a voice of realism from Japanese strategic planning, but it did not change the fundamental mathematics of the war. External fuel tanks remain essential equipment for military aircraft 80 years later. Modern fighter aircraft carry sophisticated composite tanks that can withstand higher speeds and G-forces than the aluminum tanks Lockheed designed for the P-38. The F-15 Eagle typically carries 3 external tanks holding approximately 1,350 gallons total. The F-16 Fighting Falcon routinely flies with 2 or 3 external tanks depending on mission requirements. The F/A-18 Super Hornet extends its range using external tanks for strike missions hundreds of miles from the carrier. Every modern fighter depends on drop tanks for extended range operations. Even stealth aircraft make trade-offs to accommodate external tanks. The F-35 Lightning II can carry external tanks when operating in permissive environments where stealth is less critical than range. This flexibility allows the aircraft to perform long-range strike missions when needed, accepting temporarily reduced stealth for increased operational radius. A modern composite drop tank costs approximately $20,000 to $50,000. An aerial refueling sortie costs hundreds of thousands of dollars. For missions within drop tank range, external tanks are far more economical than tanker support. This economic advantage ensures that drop tanks will remain relevant even as aerial refueling becomes more sophisticated. The story of Operation Vengeance is ultimately about the importance of innovation in military effectiveness. Benjamin Kelsey saw what needed to be done and had the courage to do it despite bureaucratic opposition. Oliver P. Eccles provided the institutional protection that allowed innovation to proceed. Lockheed engineers designed and built the technology. Navy cryptanalysts provided the intelligence. Admiral Mitchell recognized the opportunity. John Mitchell navigated perfectly. Rex Barber executed with skill and courage. Each contribution was essential. Each required different skills and occupied different roles. The mission succeeded because all these elements came together at the right moment. Remove any element and the mission fails. This is the fundamental lesson for anyone interested in how organizations achieve difficult objectives. Innovation requires people willing to challenge established doctrine when it is wrong. Kelsey could have followed orders and avoided risk. He chose to defy the bomber Mafia because he understood their doctrine would cost lives. His willingness to take that risk created capabilities that saved thousands of lives. Innovation requires organizational structures that protect innovators from bureaucratic retaliation. Eccles could have enforced the prohibition. He chose to protect Kelsey and allow the work to proceed. Without this protection, Kelsey's initiative would have been crushed. Innovation requires skilled engineers who can turn concepts into hardware. Lockheed's engineers designed effective drop tanks in weeks. Factory workers built them in months. Excellence in execution was as important as brilliance in conception, and innovation requires operational commanders willing to use new capabilities creatively. Mitchell could have declined the mission as too risky. Mitchell could have argued 1,000-mile fighter missions were impossible. Instead, they accepted the challenge and executed perfectly. Technology creates possibilities, but people must choose to exploit those possibilities. Benjamin Kelsey died in 1981 with relatively little public recognition. His obituary noted his contributions to fighter development, but did not emphasize how his defiance created capabilities that proved decisive. The general public, to the extent it knows about Operation Vengeance, remembers the pilots who flew the mission, but not the engineer who made it possible. This anonymity reflects broader patterns in how military history is remembered. Combat soldiers become heroes. Pilots who shoot down enemies become aces. But engineers who design equipment remain obscure. Their contributions are less dramatic and harder to quantify, but without them, military forces cannot function effectively. Operation Vengeance succeeded because of accumulated contributions at every level. Engineers developed technology. Cryptanalysts provided intelligence. Planners coordinated logistics. Pilots executed the mission. Each element was necessary but not sufficient. Success required all of them working together. 80 years later, military forces still depend on people like Benjamin Kelsey. They need officers who understand technology well enough to recognize when regulations prevent necessary innovation. They need engineers who can turn concepts into hardware quickly. They need commanders who can exploit new capabilities creatively. And they need institutional structures flexible enough to accommodate innovation while maintaining necessary discipline. The balance is delicate and never perfect. Organizations that allow too much deviation lose coherence. Organizations that enforce doctrine too rigidly become obsolete. Finding the right balance is one of the fundamental challenges of military leadership. Kelsey and Eccles found that balance in 1941. Their judgment was vindicated in 1943 when P-38 Lightnings equipped with forbidden drop tanks flew 1,000 miles to kill Admiral Yamamoto. That mission stands as testament to the power of innovation and the courage of individuals who defy wrong-headed policies when lives depend on getting it right. The forbidden fuel tanks that made Operation Vengeance possible represent something larger than one successful mission. They represent the principle that innovation should not be constrained by bureaucratic resistance to change. They represent the importance of individuals who understand technology and are willing to take risks to provide capabilities that will be needed. And they represent the reality that wars are won not just by soldiers who fight, but by engineers who provide the tools that make victory possible. In the end, this is the story of how one engineer's unauthorized phone call in November 1941 changed the course of the Pacific War. Kelsey authorized modifications that violated official policy. 16 months later, those modifications enabled 18 P-38 Lightnings to fly 1,000 miles and kill the architect of Pearl Harbor. The chain of causation ran from quiet bureaucratic defiance to dramatic combat success, illustrating how military effectiveness is really built. Not through battlefield heroics alone, but through the accumulated contributions of people at every level who see what needs to be done and find ways to do it. Operation Vengeance proves that sometimes the most important battles are fought not with guns and bombs, but with innovation and the courage to challenge orthodoxy when lives depend on it.